How do we make collapse the least brutal experience possible? How do we make it, alleviate as much suffering as possible? Not that we can alleviate all suffering, not that it's going to be this wonderful, hold hands and dance around the world, because it is not. But how do we take some of the brutality out of it?
I'm very happy to have with me today Carolyn Baker, and just in case there's anybody who hasn't heard of Carolyn Baker in this space, she's probably one of the most prolific writers that I know of, talking about facing collapse. On top of a daily blog that she writes, she's also written 13 books, the latest of which, Radical Regeneration, she co-wrote with Andrew Harvey, which we'll be touching on a little bit today. She's also been a psychotherapist for 17 years and a professor of psychology for 10. So I want to really welcome you, Carolyn, and I also want to thank you because we did an interview 2 weeks ago, I think, maybe a little bit more than 2 weeks ago, and something went wrong with the recording on my end. So you very graciously have agreed to come back and redo that. So big thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you. That sort of glitch has happened to me many times. I have great empathy for others to whom it happens. And, I did not want that conversation to go down the drain. So I said, yeah, I'll come back for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. And look, let's dive in. I was having a look at your blog posts, which you do daily on carolynbaker.net, and I saw the heading there, which you have on top of every one, bearing witness to the darkness and the light. And one of the things that really strikes me about you is that you manage to look in both directions very clearly and very strongly. And that is something quite unique, I think, that you do. And I thought we might start in the most difficult place, really, which is sort of being together directly looking towards the dark. I know your chapter, and I'd like to cover the light here as well, but your chapter 3 in Radical Regeneration was certainly very stark and named things very clearly. And I thought maybe just get you to talk about that chapter a little bit and what we're facing as a global civilization here, and just to name it as a stepping off point.
Yeah. So Andrew calls it the dark night of the soul, the dark night of the globe, actually, the global dark night. And I share that position as well. And I also tend to name it as humanity's rite of passage, or a planetary rite of passage, because I really believe that that is the stage that humans have arrived at, where it's very much like in the tribal traditions of our ancient ancestors, and still some modern indigenous groups, where a child is prepared from birth for the rite of passage or initiatory experience. And so when it comes, they're not surprised by it. They've been preparing for it for, maybe 12, 13 years. And then the men take the boys out into the wilderness, the women take the girls out into the wilderness, and they take them through some kind of ordeal. And it's in nature, and it's dangerous. And even though the elders are around to support them, it pretty much happens alone. So it's a shock to the system. It compels them to go very deep inside themselves, to reach down within themselves and discover their core, their sacred self, and use that to help them cope with the ordeal and survive the ordeal. And by the way, it's very dangerous. It was always some kind of brush with death. And there was no guarantee that anybody would survive. Mostly they did, but sometimes they didn't. And then the next thing we ask ourselves is, why would a community require or prepare a child for going through a brush with death? Well, because the community from experience had learned that if a child didn't go through that rite of passage, they'd never grow up and they would actually become toxic to the community. So the community was willing to take the risk in having this rite of passage so that the young person would have that divine sacred experience of contacting their deeper resources within, and then they were prepared in a mature fashion to take their place in the community. That's the long and the short of the rite of passage. Now, I believe that we as humans in 2021 are in a similar process where we are being compelled to we are in a rite of passage. And our work is to go within, not only to do things without in the external world that would improve the situation where that's possible, and in many cases it's not only to work externally, but to work internally and to become, in a way, a student of this whole ordeal. What is this trying to teach me about myself, about others, and about the planet?
When I think about more Indigenous cultures that had those rites of passage, it was like everyone was prepared for it. Whereas in this one, you're talking about it, but it's certainly not what most people are talking about. There's very little preparation. There's very little holding. There's not a community to come back to celebrate. So there's a few differences. And as well, when I think about a rite of passage, I think about a psychological journey from one state to another. Whereas, I think you and I both agree that there's going to be massive, there's a possibility of complete extinction here. So there's many of us, billions of us, that aren't going to make it through to another side. So how do we approach this as a rite of passage with those two things, not knowing if we'll survive, and also not having a community that understands it?
Well, remember that the young person in the actual initiation didn't know if he or she would survive either.
Yeah.
And the elders didn't know if they would survive.
Yes.
So it was very daunting. And then right now, we don't have a community that has prepared us. But our work really is to create community that can be with us in the process, and we can be with them. And it's not like we come back to them, but it's like we're all together at the same time, and different ones of us are going through different initiations, different rite of passage experiences, but all in the same cauldron, you might say, of this planetary rite of passage. And so we really need to support each other and notice that this is what we're going through. Now, what Carl Jung said, and I've been a student of Jung for a long time, he studied initiations. He went around the world and visited various tribes where they were doing initiations. And he came back to the West and he said, we don't have those formal rites of passage, but we have other things in our lives, smaller rites of passage that we go through all the time, like maybe a terminal illness, maybe a divorce, maybe a bankruptcy and the loss of everything, maybe the loss of a body part, any kind of serious loss. And so he said, we should navigate those experiences in the same way as if they are rites of passage for us. And one of the things that he really concluded is that as we prepare for and we go through these little deaths, little deaths. It helps prepare us for the big death, which is truly the end of our physical lives. And it's all of that is a letting go, letting go. And the young person in the Indigenous rite of passage is letting go of who they thought they were, letting go of their identity, to be gobsmacked by another identity, by this ordeal that profoundly changes them. And they'll never be the same person.
As we head in, we're basically looking at the loss of pretty much everything we know here. And it can be overwhelming. And meeting that, if I take on meeting that as this is a rite of passage, what does it feel to be possibly letting go of nature as I've known it, this as I've known it? It does help. And I mean, when someone like you talks about rite of passage, and I feel like it's a good place to bring this in here. You are no stranger to that. You've survived cancer twice. You grew up a gay woman in the right-wing Bible Belt of America. So you do well and truly know what you're talking about in rites of passage. And what did you find in yourself in those experiences?
Well, let's start with the childhood experiences first, the growing up in a milieu that was profoundly homophobic and getting kicked out of a religious school because I was gay and all of that. I'm writing a book now called Confronting Christofascism, in which I'm talking about the evangelical wound, not only personally, but culturally, what it's doing to us, what it has done to us, and how do we recover. And so, it was a stripping away of what I had thought about myself, a letting go of all that, and then struggling to find my own identity, my own belief systems. In a sense, I was kind of developmentally delayed because I didn't have the skills, coming out of that fundamentalist milieu. I didn't have the critical thinking skills. And thank God I was able to go to university and get a good education. That's what really saved me. But it was a stripping away and then also a taking on the whole process of being a thinking adult. And so throughout my life, it's been a journey, like everyone else. It's a journey from things that are just absolutely of no use to us to newer vistas of who we are and who we want to be. And so today, at the age of 75, I don't feel that I've arrived, but I feel very comfortable with my spiritual path and the way I view the world. Some people would describe it as negative. I describe it as realistic. And I also carry with me a tremendous amount of joy and fulfillment as I live with this darkness. And all of that has kind of prepared me to face cancer, breast cancer, a couple of times. And, the second time I was 20 years older than the first time. So I'm 20 years closer to the end of my life. And so I see all of that as a preparation for the big death. It was one of those little deaths. It didn't feel like little, it felt really big. But I survived. And so somewhere, somehow, I've got a big death ahead of me. But those experiences prepared me for the letting go. And I'm a big fan of the work of Stephen Jenkinson, who wrote the wonderful book, Die Wise. And so that is the work of all of us on some level, even if we're a millennial, to allow ourselves to learn how to die wise. And we learn that day by day in things that we die to, in things that we let go of, so that we're more prepared for when it really is finished.
I think one of the things in terms of that letting go and going through those processes of recognition and, you know, little rites of passage, if you like, is facing grief. And we talked about this the last time we spoke as well. And I just want to preempt this with a story. I had dinner with a friend of mine a couple of nights ago who's very aware of what's going on in the environment. But he said to me, he's a parent for a start, but he said, I can't think about it anymore. It's too much. I can't do it. And one of the things that I felt when he said that was, what he can't do is to feel the grief that he's feeling. And I think many of us feel the same way. It's overwhelming. In your book, I think it was in your book or in something that you've written, you have said, through grief we find a refuge for ourselves and for the world. And I really enjoyed that line, and I think it connects to your own personal journey as well. And I'd just love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. In Western cultures, grief is absolutely not acceptable. Of course, if there's a death in the family or in your life, you know, if you're fortunate, you have some bereavement leave, but you're supposed to come back from that completely over it. You know, it's behind you, and now you're ready to move on. And there is so little understanding of grief. It's, you know, if we're grieving, it's like you're a loser, you're going to get stuck in this, get over it and move on, you know, move on, move on. And yet grief is like this pull, you know, that really says, come on down inside. Come on away from, for a while, away from the rest of the world. Come on down inside and see what's there. And when we allow ourselves to do that, we find not only grief, but we find ultimately joy. You know, William Blake said, the deeper the sorrow, the greater the joy. And I'm convinced that because we're in such a feelingless culture in lots of ways, a numbed out culture, because we can't feel grief, we can't feel joy. One of my great, one of the people I deeply respect around grief work, besides Stephen Jenkinson, is Francis Weller, who wrote the wonderful book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And he talks about how we are very much in a flatline culture. You know, don't feel too much. Don't feel too much sadness. Don't feel too much anger. In fact, that's not really acceptable. Don't feel too much fear. What are you, a coward? And just, you know, kind of hum along in this gray world, which he calls a flatline culture. A flatline culture, which is, you know, emotionally kind of dead. And so, you know, when something like grief shakes us, we just go, oh, you know, no, I got to get over it. I got to move on. And there's a real miscalculation, I think, about getting stuck in grief. Well, I don't want to get stuck in grief because we all feel sometimes like we'll never stop grieving. And the fact is, when we have huge losses in our lives, there are some things we can't get over. Grief is something you learn to live with. And as Francis Weller speaks of it, he says, develop an apprenticeship with sorrow, an apprenticeship, in which you say to sorrow, kind of like you do with initiation, okay, here it is. I'm going to learn from you. What do you have to teach me? I am your student. I don't like it. It feels horrible sometimes, but I'm going to be your student because I'm going to feel other things besides grief. And one of the things that Western culture doesn't get is that grief and joy are very connected. Mary Oliver wrote, we shake with grief, we shake with joy. You know, these two are tied up in the same body. You know, they need each other. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. And so when we allow ourselves to grieve, and I've had many people tell me this, the joy begins to open up. Because in this culture, we don't know what joy is. We think joy is happiness, and happiness is circumstantial. It comes and goes depending on what's happening. Whereas joy is deep within our core, and it's going to be there whether we're happy or not happy. And so grief helps us tap in to that joy, which is really all about meaning. And it was Viktor Frankl who wrote about his experiences in Auschwitz and the joy that he had, not because he was happy, not because he liked anything that was going on, but because he found meaning and purpose. That was his joy.
Yes, yeah, and discovering that in these times, you know, needs a considerable rethink, because it doesn't go along any of the same lines that that most of us have previously considered.
No.
But just picking up on that grief, because in a sense, it's easy to say, and I just want to talk about one of my own experiences recently, and just sort of dig in from there. So I watched this Netflix documentary. I don't know if you've seen it, Seaspiracy.
I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. Talking about what's going on in the oceans. And it took me 3 goes to get through it. Because it was just like, oh, you know, I mean, I love the ocean. I live near the ocean. I see the ocean, or I'm in it most days, pretty much every day. And so to see what humans are doing to the oceans, if we're not polluting it, if we're not overfishing it or pouring nuclear waste into it, you know, we're dragging these nets along or wiping out everything, cutting the fins off sharks and just throwing the bodies into the water. It pains me so deeply. It's right on my threshold of I just cannot bear it. I can't bear it. And so much of what's going on the planet now fills me with this same thing. And it's very hard to go, there's, you know, this will lead to joy somehow. And
Yeah.
I'm sure there's many people listening with similar experiences, so it might be good to dig in there.
Mhm. Well, it might be interesting to see what happens if you let yourself really grieve, like you're watching a few minutes of it and it just feels unbearable, and then you stop and you have some space and some silence, and you let yourself grieve. You let some tears come, and just be with that for a while, and then notice next day, couple days, whenever. Notice if there's some kind of appearance or expression of joy that comes forth. I was thinking as you were talking about that horrible documentary, I was also thinking of another documentary, My Octopus Teacher.
Yes, see, yeah.
And boy, there is joy.
Yeah.
There is joy. And it's happening in the same ocean.
Yeah.
You know, this horrifying stuff is happening alongside this glorious experience of bonding with this animal that transforms this man.
Yeah.
And it's not that one cancels out the other, but right now, I believe one of our main challenges is to be able to hold the opposites.
Yes.
Can we hold those opposites in the same body? It's really hard work, and yet it's what's real. It's what's happening. So I challenge all of us, including myself, to do that work.
Yeah. And I suppose, you know, the one of the purposes of doing this work, and one of the purposes of having this conversation, is because there's a collapse that's underway, and it's how we're going to do this collapse together is the critical thing. And if we don't pay attention to this, well, I guess if we do pay attention to this, perhaps we can make it a little more gentle in some way, or a little more graceful, or a little more kind.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this book right now on confronting Christofascism,
Yes,
because I
yes.
see authoritarianism as one of the most brutal things that's happening around the planet. Um, and we're on the knife edge here in the United States of it can go either way. We narrowly escaped the eternal domination of Trump, and don't know what's going to happen going forward. But my desire, and that could mean nothing in the long run, but my desire and what I'm putting passion into these days is how do we make collapse the least brutal experience possible? How do we make it, alleviate as much suffering as possible?
Mm.
Not that we can alleviate all suffering, not that it's going to be this wonderful, hold hands and dance around the world, because it is not. But how do we take some of the brutality out of it? And community, connections with other people, helps with that. Whether that's weeping together, whether that's protesting together, whether that's celebrating together, whatever that is, it makes it a little less brutal.
Mm, mm. It's so well put. It's so well put. I'm interested, in this book that you're writing, the about Christian
Confronting
fascism. Yeah,
Christofascism. Yeah.
yeah. And in my documentary, when I was speaking to Stan Rushworth,
Mm.
one of the things that he referred to was we grow up with this idea that we were kicked out of the garden. It starts there. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. You think that's where it really starts from, that the myth that we carry about that, or how has Christianity become this mockery of itself, really?
Well, it's another version of the story of separation, that we are separate from nature. That's principally the deal. We're separate from nature. And we're separate from each other by virtue of race or belief systems or gender or whatever that is. And we're separate as a result of that. We're separate from ourselves. And so it's really about what does that mean, separate? Well, that's a lie that we've been told. How do we realize our deep and profound connection? And that's a lot of work, is to go back to that story of union. I'm a fan of Matthew Fox, who wrote the wonderful book Original Blessing. Not original sin, original blessing. What is the blessing of nature that I can experience? What is the blessing of being with you and other people in my community? And what's the blessing of being with myself? I am a freaking miracle, and you are a freaking miracle. And so, how do we rejoin? Because we've been so brutalized and separated with this dualism.
And how do we rejoin? I feel like we're so, our identities are so built around there's nature and there's humans, or,
Yeah.
anthropocentrism, as they call it. How do we rejoin the natural world?
Well, I think a lot of times people need to retrain themselves in how to do that. As children, we didn't need any training. And, back in my day, when I was a kid, we were outside most of the day, just outside playing in nature. And, maybe the street lights went on. Well, it's time to go home, but we were in nature, in the dirt, in the soil, in the trees, loved to climb trees. And so we have to retrain ourselves as adults. And I recommend that people spend at least an hour a week in nature, to just go out and be in it. You don't have to do anything. It's like, well, I'm going to go for a run, or I'm going to climb a mountain. No, how about just going out and meditating, being present in nature, listening to the sounds, smelling the smells, taking it all in, and seeing with eyes that are not analyzing, like, oh, that's that kind of bird. Oh, that's that kind of tree. Just, you're there and you're celebrating and you're drinking it in as you did as a kid. And you're drinking it in and you're feeling it. And maybe you want to do something crazy like talk to a tree or talk to a bird or an animal, and what happens? And listen. What might they be telling you? And it doesn't have to be right. It doesn't have to be accurate. Just listen. I'm sure Stan Rushworth, says the same kinds of things in his writing because he's a native person. He grew up in this. And that's what we need to become is natives again. Not that we're wannabe Indians, but we really become native in the sense of this is the soil that we're planted in. Sharon Blackie's book, when women rise up rooted, to become rooted again in nature, in the glories of this planet.
It's so beautifully put. And yes, look, I stopped doing the naming thing. What sort of bird is that, or what sort of tree is that, a while ago. However, what I do now, and it was when you were speaking, I was reminded of it. I do, what's going to happen to that ocean, or soon all that'll be gone. I run the collapse scenarios rather than just being present in the moment with nature as it is now. Yeah.
And I really want to encourage people to look at that because I think that sometimes our extinction awareness gets in our way of being really present right now. And yes, we can go out into the forest and we can think about how that won't be here anymore at some point, or we can go, okay, yeah, that's true, but I'm going to set that aside for a moment. It's not untrue. I'm not denying it. I'm just going to set it over here while I enjoy this gorgeous, gorgeous nature and feel it in my body for right now. While I have it, I want to be here. I want to be really present. I can go back to extinction tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I think there's something you said. Let me just find it here. Yeah, this need to be present. You've said, which I loved in your book. You said it's as if we're at the center of an explosion, and any fantasy that we can control it will both be foolish and lethal. That type of presence.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we can't control in what's happening, but we can be present. Yeah. We can be present right now. And that is not the, I'm not suggesting a dualistic thing where, well, all I do is I just focus on the now. Well, you can only focus on the now for so long. But, okay, you want to talk about extinction, you want to look at extinction, okay, and then come back to the now. Extinction it's going to be there. It's real, but come back to the now for now.
Yes. Yeah. There is a definite possibility that we go extinct. You don't deny it. I don't think anybody who's got their head in this can deny it. But you also do outline a possibility. Well, if some humans do survive, you outline that possibility and where we want to put our attention now as we come into these events. And I think it's worthwhile going there to speak to this.
Sure. Yeah. We take a lot of our ideas, not a lot, but some of our ideas in the book, in Radical Regeneration, from Paul Levy's book, The Quantum Revelation. And Paul Levy has done such wonderful work. He's also a psychotherapist. He's done such wonderful work on quantum physics and spirituality. And he talks about, how in the quantum field, everything's about possibility. Nothing is written in stone. And so, we bring into the book that there's possibility. Who knows what will happen to the human species ultimately. A lot of times we have this notion that, well, extinction means that we're all going to get wiped out off the planet. There will be no more humans. That's it, over. And that may happen. That could well happen. But is it possible that there might be, and who knows how long they would last, a pocket of humans that might survive some huge, enormous extinction event? And if so, how might they be changed by it? And what might they decide to rebuild or build anew if they were to survive for a while? We don't know. We can let our imagination run wild. What's wrong with that? And not slap ourselves on the hands because we're thinking possibility. We just don't know. There's so much uncertainty in this. And one of the things we emphasize in radical regeneration is the need to become comfortable with uncertainty. 10 years ago, I was running groups every week where people were talking about, well, we're not going to be here in 10 years. Collapse will have happened, extinction, will be dead. So we might as well just enjoy our group right now. And we're still here. Collapse is happening much more slowly than we anticipated, but it's not, how it plays out is not a certainty. We can work for a less brutal collapse like I'm doing, but I don't know what's going to happen. And so become comfortable with uncertainty, a wonderful book written by Pema Chodron that I highly recommend. Because the Western mind has made us believe that we have to know. We have to know what's going to happen. And we don't.
Yes, and we don't. There's so much in that, isn't there? Even, because the knowing can be in two directions on this score. It can be, it's not going to happen. I deny the whole thing and everything's going to go on just as it is. And there's plenty of that still in the world. And the other knowing on the other side is, I know exactly how it's going to go and we're all going extinct and all of nature will be gone. And as you say, the truth is we don't know, and it's actually excruciating to live in it, truly. To not know how it's going to go down and
or when. Yeah. And so I think that's why some people get very obsessed with extinction, because that's easier than the not knowing.
Yeah.
I want to also recommend to folks the work of Jim Bendell and deep adaptation. There's a Facebook page. There are not every day, but every few weeks, new articles on jembendell.com. That's JEMBENDELL. Who's a professor in the UK, and I think really has a grasp of what we need to be doing emotionally and spiritually, as well as logistically and in terms of our activism and environmental justice.
Yeah, I've spent some time with Jem, and I very much agree with you there. He does seem to cover quite a large bit of ground in terms of how we prepare for the times. And I know he's interviewed you as well, hasn't he?
Yes, he has.
Yeah. And in terms of your own preparation, Carolyn, as we go forward into these times, how are you preparing?
Well, I have a meditation practice that I do twice a day that I've done for 42 years. And I don't beat myself up. You have to do this. It's just something I want to do. And I'm living intentionally close to nature. I'm living in the West, right up against the Rocky Mountains in Boulder, Colorado. I keep myself informed. I keep I keep a strong community around me. And if that's not a community that's right here, accessible down the street or something, it's all over the country. People that I can call up in a heartbeat and say, did you see this? What do you think about that? And, maybe a group call and we can all connect. And I'm doing much more work online, and coaching is as rewarding for me as it is for the people who come and seek help. I try to create joy and fulfillment in my life as much as possible. The savoring of these moments. And again, being a student of what's unfolding. What do you want me to learn from this? What do you want me to do with this? Who can I serve? Whether it's volunteering in a homeless shelter, or volunteering in an animal shelter, or there's so much we can do that brings joy. It brings fulfillment. Yeah, it might break our hearts too, but it brings tremendous joy. We shake with grief, we shake with joy. What a time these two have, housed as they are in the same body.
That's just so
Thank you, Mary Oliver.
Yes, yeah, that's so rich. I almost don't know where to go after that, Carolyn. It feels like that could be a conclusion. And
I'd love to conclude with Mary Oliver.
Okay, please. Yes.
That's what else? What else do you say after that?
Yeah, what else do you say after that? Yes, yeah. Well, Carolyn, it's a delight to talk to you, and to talk to someone who's offering so much into this space. And if you don't know Carolyn's work, there's 13 books, the latest of which, Radical Regeneration, is excellent, and full of beautiful quotes from many poets, I might add, from going on from Mary Oliver, and also your daily blog, on which you can access through carolynbaker.net. Yeah.
Yes, carolynbaker.net, and click on the subscribe tab, and you can sign up for the daily news digest. And then also, I'd like to add that you can email me at carolyn@carolynbaker.net to find out about an event that my colleague Terry Chapman and I are doing starting May 3rd. It's going to be a 10-week online course called Weaving Threads of Grief and Joy in a Time of Unraveling.
Well, that sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
You'll be getting an email from me.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Great.
yes, yeah. Carolyn, thank you again. So lovely to talk to you, and I hope we get to talk again.
Me too.
Yeah.
I would love it.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.